So to wind up this first day, we're going to talk about geopolitics. I'm very pleased to welcome Yann, Captain. He has an outstanding career. You were very operational in the first part of your career. You were a helicopter pilot in France, Germany, and UK. Then you touched on diplomacy and international relations in Brazil, within the EU. You were, in fact, one of the members of the French presidency of the EU cabinet, and you've also worked in Yale. You're currently in charge of strategy in policy for the French Navy. And we've talked quite a lot about the war in Ukraine, ever since this morning, in fact. I wanted to know how you saw things looming on the horizon. 24th February of this year, Putin triggered a military operation in Ukraine despite the growing tension in the preceding days. Some people were surprised that he actually invaded. Were you? And what's your analysis currently of the geopolitical situation? You have the floor. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this forum for enabling me to take the floor. I think that the world of maritime insurance and the Navy have a lot to say to each other. Perhaps it's a good idea to get to know each other better, and we should do so in the future. This is a wonderful opportunity, therefore, to talk about the challenges for the Navy and to answer your question about Ukraine. Were we surprised? Yes and no. In December of last year, our Admiral signed a paper which talked about the return of naval combats, naval war. We circulated this amongst our British and American colleagues, and reference was made to confrontation at sea. We were expecting this to happen, therefore. Conversely, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, a lot of information circulated, thanks to our American partners, and I think we all suffered from a cognitive bias. We all thought the war would be too expensive for Putin. We thought this would be unreasonable for Russia for economic reasons, but we realized that while it's very costly for the Kremlin, the decision was taken. So we were quite surprised by the conflict, which has speeded up trends that we'd already observed. And this is what I'm going to show you in the next few slides. 3 points. The deterioration in the geostrategic context. It's quite unheard of over the last 30 years. And then, what are the main challenges for the Navy? How are we going to respond, in other words? On this slide, you have some pictures which sum up the Navy's activities over the last 30 years. We've been policing fishing, projecting power. You can see planes on the Charles de Gaulle to combat terrorism, or you can see our frigates patrolling the coasts of some of our competitors. Drug trafficking, which has really taken off. We have doubled the amount of drugs seized in the sea. We've gone from 41 tons of cannabis, cocaine, and heroin, and synthetic drugs, something much greater, and then the fight against terrorism, which you can see in the middle. What's the guiding principle here? The sea at the time was viewed as a sort of a sanctuary. We didn't think we'd be challenged at sea, and this has changed radically. On the 24th February, the Charles de Gaulle was in the eastern Mediterranean. There were 20 Russian frigates that were just nearby. Now, what characterizes this new geopolitical cycle? As you can see, there's been a huge development in technology, cyber defense, cyber attacks, drones. We've witnessed a speeding up of technological change, and we have to keep this pace in order to keep pace with our competitors who are moving ahead fast. And then we have the political will, which has changed. People are no longer reluctant to use violence. People are happy to call into question international law standards which enabled us to live in a safer world in preceding years. Here you have a couple of examples. On the lower left, you can see this little island in the South China Sea, which has been turned into an aero-naval base by China. You have a whole host of fishing boats. This kind of challenge is quite hybrid. It's not necessarily huge ships where aircraft land. Look at Argentina about a month ago and what happened there. You can see this Turkish oil exploration ship, which was escorted in the eastern Mediterranean by 5 frigates in order to carry out its work. There's another very important point in this new context. It's climate change. The northern route may potentially open one day. If it opens to shipping, that will open up much earlier than to military vessels. And look at our overseas territories. We may have to intervene ever more frequently because of climate change. Here's another point which characterizes the geopolitical cycle: the unprecedented naval rearming of countries. This is the Pacific. I could have shown you the Mediterranean. In the case of China, between 2008 to 2030, there's a plus 138% in shipping tonnage. There's a third aircraft carrier. The third aircraft carrier will remain abroad, and you have the third is 80,000 tons, and it has an electromagnetic catapult system. In France, we have these systems on Charles de Gaulle, but which will be active in 2028 only. So you can see that progress is huge in just a decade in terms of the Chinese fleet. People are rearming throughout the area. Maybe the idea is to support national technology and industry, but look at the colossal investment required. Obviously, it's a question of national prestige as well. What we fear is that the idea is to use these naval means, not necessarily to wage a war, but to create a sort of fait accompli. It's canon policy. The risk has been well understood. That's why the other countries surrounding China are rearming too. The aircraft carriers, well, I referred to that for China. You have a third now. Japan has made huge efforts. It's changed some of its vessels into aircraft carriers. You can see this rearmament thrust, which is clearly visible around the Earth. This map may bear out the risks you have seen in your various professions. You have these areas where there's a lot of tension, and the French Navy is present. Let's start by the most western one in the South China Sea. We patrol there quite regularly. You may say that's a long way away, the South China Sea. Why send French naval vessels there? Well, there are American and British vessels and those of other nations as well. It's of fundamental importance. By calling into question freedom to navigate on the high seas, this is what China is doing, other nations might be interested in doing the same thing. They might practice this principle in other areas, like the Mediterranean. That would affect us more directly. On this map, you can see our exclusive economic area. It's the second biggest in the world. Some people say, quite rightly, that it's not the second biggest, but the first biggest. First is that of the U.S. It runs all down the American coast. Ours is located a bit throughout the world, and it's a wonderful asset for France. It enables us to talk with people like Brazil, Mozambique, Solomon Islands, a lot of other countries, and we're legitimate because we're present in all these oceans. Admiral Landier is the president of the East Indian Ocean Naval Forum, and he took over from Iran. I imagine the ceremony was particularly enlightening, but in this forum, the heads of various navies can talk together because we have a legitimate presence in the Indian Ocean. So it's a huge asset, not to mention the other resources you have in the area. These are resources we can manage to protect despite our limited means in the area, but it's sufficient for the time being. And we use satellites as well, which are very useful when it comes to intervening where necessary if there is a threat or a predatory risk. The question which arises, if there is such predatory danger, plus climate change, if fishing resources change their location, will we be able still to protect our areas? I don't know. Further eastwards, we have drug trafficking in the West Indies. Read Thomas Goma's book called, which was recently published. You can see that drug trafficking is a real threat, just like, the title of the book is Invisible Wars. It's as big a threat as those represented by other states in terms of security. Now, if you cross the Atlantic, look at all the underwater cables. They are extremely important. 98% of data on the internet goes through these cables, and if they're cut one day, well, if it's only TikTok, that'll be good news. But if banking transactions can no longer be conducted or can't be conducted at their current speed, it would be a real problem for our economies. If obviously you're not going to cut all the cables, but just a few key ones, then you can slow down the flow, and that will be a real problem for our economies. Here I have a small submarine, which is a Russian one in the Atlantic, because in this area, this was published in Le Monde 2 years ago, there's a competition, a major competition. French nuclear power is in this area with nuclear submarines, and we don't want to have Russian nuclear submarines too. So we're trying to push aside these submarines and ensure that we can properly patrol the area. Now, let's go lower. You have the Gulf of Guinea. I think there are some representatives of West African states here. Maybe they'll ask me some questions later on. In partnership with these states, we're working to combat illegal fishing, piracy as well. These are all problems which concern you. The stakes are high, in fact, for our economies and for the states in the region. The fight against illegal fishing is a real issue. Now, the Mediterranean, conflicts in Libya and Syria haven't been solved. I'll talk about Ukraine later on. That's leading to major destabilization. And then if you go down to the Red Sea, there the stakes are high. You have choke points, straits just before Yemen, which is at war. That's where there's a lot of commercial shipping. And the flow of energy, well, with the Ukrainian crisis, energy flows have changed around the world. Much more energy will come from the Persian Gulf. So we have to protect these routes against potentially aggressive action, not waged by states, but by proxies, which might disturb this traffic in a major way. Persian Gulf, the agreement, a nuclear agreement with Iran, which is in a very bad shape, and then you have heroin, which travels from Afghanistan and flows into many countries, including South Africa, Madagascar, and others. La Réunion is quite close to there. It's been protected so far, but maybe soon affected. And then it goes up to Europe and the U.S.
Sorry, I'm not sharing a lot of good news on this map. I'm sorry for that, but it's sort of my daily life now. And another essential theme, which is a shared concern, the control of maritime data. It's important for us to understand what's going on, and understanding what's going on goes through analyzing open source data, information provided by AIS or other observation systems, and then with AI we can detect what's abnormal, a ship that switches off its AIS or not following the declared route, and it's all going to the MICA Center, which is now getting some international celebrity. We were recently approached by pirates near Bab el-Mandeb, and the ship owner called the MICA Center, and so an Italian frigate was rerouted to help this ship. It's rooted in the global ecosystem of maritime data fusion, and we have liaison officers in India and Singapore, because the Indo-Pacific is the place to be to get access to this information. And so we can access a huge flow of maritime data. And you've got other centers, one in Madagascar with support from the EU, which is also quite effective. Some words about Ukraine. You probably have this conflict in mind, and of course the role that the Navy can play. What this conflict reminded us of, and we are remembering the 40 years of the Falklands battle, is the attrition and how quick and devastating a naval combat is. And so they lost 23 ships in just a few months. And now we have 15 first-tier frigates in the French Navy. That shows you the extent of the devastation and what we're talking about. Another thing that was very striking for the naval dimension in this conflict is that very quickly there was a nuclear dialogue that was created between NATO nations and Vladimir Putin, who had up to 6 SMLEs cast off. And very quickly there was this dialogue that was put in place. One fundamental thing for the Navy, we were before the crisis and we were during the crisis, we were in direct contact with these Russian forces around the Charles de Gaulle and the Truman, which was also in these waters. And so we could see the change in the behavior by Russian forces and the de-escalation channels. With these weak signals, it was very important to understand the positioning of the Russians. The sea is in fact an extremely useful space for states to express their will. It's much more difficult to bring Russian tanks on the Cathedral Square in Strasbourg, but you can do a lot of different things. You can approach a frigate, you can cut it off, as Chinese Coast Guards do when we're in the South China Sea. These are so many signals that you can send. This is policy that you communicate to the adverse camp side. And so a question that is asked with this conflict, for 30 years the opponents that we've met were the Iranian Pasdaran, Somali pirates, lightly armed forces against which, if something were to happen, we could fully accept the principle of self-defense. We would get the first burst of automatic weapons and then we could reply. But if you have a Chinese cruiser with 112 vertical silos when we only have 32, it's a bit more difficult to respond. And then there's the question of shooting first, but in terms of international law and political commitment, it's a delicate question. And that can't be decided so simply, but this is a real question right now. And that sort of summarizes what I've said. We're in a world where the law has less weight than the fait accompli policy and brute force, and that's quite deplorable. And so what we could see at the beginning of this conflict is that the format of the Navy is consistent. We've got all of the tools to answer. We've got nuclear submarines, mine hunter ships, and an aircraft carrier. We've got all the technological building blocks with which we practice regularly, so we've got all the means necessary, but maybe not in the right numbers. And then a connection with the previous conference, a cooperation. I won't quote from Henry Ford, but cooperation is essential. Of course, France can't solve all these crises on its own, be it in the east of Africa, but with our African partners, but with Russia or China, if things were to turn sour in the Indo-Pacific, we would need to face these crises with our partners. To summarize what the day after might look like, after the Ukraine crisis is over, we think that Russia's policy and geopolitical vision won't end with this Ukrainian crisis. They really want to have some weight on the geopolitical scene, and they want to remain an element of disruption with other actions. The current situation of a naval blockade imposed by Russia on Ukraine will lead to food crises that we can fear. And you can remember that most of the disruption in North African states in the last few years were due to famines in these countries. And so what we can fear in the long run and even the short run is this sort of crises happening again. All Arab Persian Gulf countries are a situation to be monitored very closely. A few signals indicating that maybe not a reversal in alliances, but a strong interest in strengthening alliances with China and Russia for any number of reasons. So maybe a lesser weight of Western nations in this area, whereas we partly depend on them for our energy supply. So that's a real area of attention. And the last thing, a opportunistic action by China. It's maybe a poorly chosen term, but political activism on the foreign policy front by China towards many countries to try and forge alliances and maybe create a bloc of states that may be not opposed but not be aligned with the Western view of the crisis and what may happen after that. The nightmare scenario that we could reach is a total decoupling of economies in two blocks, and so a confrontation that would be more or less direct as we had during the Cold War. So to summarize this geopolitical cycle, we've entered a new era. The fight against terrorism hasn't disappeared, but on top of that, you have a competition between nations, which is really the major fact that will decide the size of our action and the size of our armed forces and maybe their format. And so a reading list, if you want, you can read 2034. It's an American book on the confrontation between the US and China, and you can imagine that it ends very badly. But India plays a very particular role that is very interesting. The main challenges for the French Navy, the first one is technological. As I said, it's changing very quickly in every direction. And so we need to keep the pace on directed energy weapons, maybe not equip our next frigates, since the crises are happening now, equip our vessels with lasers that can deal with a number of targets, including drone swarms. Drones, where the French Navy is probably lagging behind, probably for legal reasons. We can't move as fast as our competitors or partners. There's the case of Turkey that was refused the import of last generation fighters, the F-35, and so they decided to develop their own fixed-wing drones that will land on these aircraft carriers, and they are like drone carriers, and they want to put that in service in 2025, so that's tomorrow. Cyber, I've discussed that, electronic warfare, hybrid conflict, so conflicts that are under the threshold. How can we address a fishing flotilla that will reach our EEZ, and what do we do that? High depths, also. The France 2030 plan for the recovery has a line for the exploration of deep sea, and also strengthening our partners' means. I commanded a frigate overseas, and so my main strength was my French flag, but it's no longer enough because we have more heavily armed vessels in front of you now. And the second challenge is in terms of HR. We've been recruiting very well for the last 3 or 4 years. French young people, maybe they want to give meaning to their commitments, have been joining us massively. This is very good, but it's difficult for us to retain our most experienced and older sailors who are probably fatigued after 20 years of general reform of public policy and doing more with less, whereas the tempo of operation hasn't weakened. People usually leave the Navy at 39 years old, and so we now have a 10% deficit. And I'm saying that sailors leave us at 39, and women even leave us at 33. And so it's a challenge. We need to adapt our program so that women will stay with us until they are 39. That's something we're working on, and that will be very useful so that we can go beyond 15% of women in the Navy when all positions and ranks are open to them. And so you have deck officers on the Charles de Gaulle. We have less than 10. And so when one of them leaves the Navy, that can have a significant impact on our activity. Nuclear engineers on aircraft carriers or submarines are also extremely precious talents. How to address all that? Well, the Chief of Staff of the Navy, Admiral Vendier, started a plan a year and a half ago called Mercator Acceleration. A fighting navy, a leading navy, a talented navy, so that we can get the best out of all our talents, so to avoid courses that are, or career development paths that are too set in stone, maybe having some coming and going between the merchant navy and the navy. For the fighting navy, maybe you've heard about that, but in November we had our first exercise called Polaris with 6,000 French, British, American, Spanish, Italian, Greek sailors. And this exercise, well, the aim was to let unit commanders have more room for maneuver than we had in previous exercises. And we innovated in a number of areas. Maybe you've heard about anti-access bubbles, very effective anti-access systems. How could we destroy these weapons with very interesting means? And so that's an innovative practice that will probably repeat in a couple of years. I don't want to scare you with this slide, but this is what we call leverage. Building a new combat ship takes 15 years, but the crises are here. So we want to have capability enhancers or a leverage, developing a new technology, more efficient data processing, using more drones. And the things that we're working on, we rented drones from a Norwegian company that can go 6,000 meters under the water to acquire more data and see whether we want to buy them. And so we want to do better and develop the lethality and the military effectiveness of what we have right now. And the last thing that is essential, partnerships. Admiral Vendier often says that we used to need polite people to have tea in the evening. Now we need to find childhood friends to go and be involved in bar brawls late at night. And so we need to be involved to be able to respond to more higher intensity conflicts. And so we are looking towards Africa, but also India because of their involvement in the Indo-Pacific, and also the EU, and focusing on the Americans. We are working with their aircraft carriers. We are ensuring anti-aerial protection around their aircraft carriers. We're landing our Rafales on their aircraft carriers. Some frigates from the US Navy protect the Charles de Gaulle, so it's strong cooperation. It hasn't changed in spite of the Australian submarine crisis. And the Admiral was in Washington last week even, and we're also working with the British and the Americans for the nuclear deterrence in the North Atlantic. And that was my last slide. Yes, that's it for me. Thank you. Thank you. We have time for a discussion. You agreed to be open to questions. Does anyone want to use this opportunity and leverage this great experience to learn a bit more? I had a first question about Ukraine, please. You talked about the consequences for us and the way you experienced it. Very concretely, what's the situation in the fields right now? Maybe you can say something about it. I can say something, probably not everything, but something. What was quite clever on the part of Russia is that before the crisis, they had a lot of ships coming in from the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet, so that there was a fait accompli, so that if any military option was chosen, it would have been very risky and a massive risk of escalation. There were also the Turkish. According to the Montreux Convention, it decided to block the passage of the straits to military ships. That was a decision by then, but it made the situational analysis more complicated. So now the Black Sea is a Russian lake, and so Russia's imposed a blockade on Ukraine, and it's asphyxiating it because cereals exports are fundamental for Ukraine, and also a lot of countries that are expecting these cereals, these grains. So maybe we could open a corridor between Odessa and the Turkish Straits, but there's the issue of mines that we need to clear, and there's a possible confrontation and escalation with Russia that's not negligible. You saw the fierce fighting on Snake Island, which is an island just near the estuary of the Danube, close to Romania, on the way to Odessa, and control of this key point means that any military initiative would be particularly complex if we were to follow this course of action. And here it's a lot more maritime than naval. You can note the great dynamism of the shipping world and the traders that were able to recreate a logistical flow to Constanța port with rail and barges, so that they could send some Ukrainian grain to Constanța to be exported. But then what's happening in the Black Sea, I'm not at liberty to disclose, but a lot of things could be happening in this area, and of course this is something that we're thinking about. Well, you seem to have answered all questions. No, there's one there. Good evening, Frédéric Denefle, Garex. Thank you for this brilliant summary. One question related to the size of French naval means. France is said to have the second largest maritime territory behind the US, so of course that assumes that we have a lot of means to exercise our sovereignty over these spaces. Do you think that France right now on its own can play this role and guarantee its sovereignty, or should we accelerate some form of European cooperation so that we can better control our French maritime territories? Thank you, that's an excellent question. Right now, in the Indo-Pacific, the most interesting area, we have 12 vessels. 12 vessels to protect our EEZ, that is as large as Europe. Admiral Prézieux, who preceded Admiral Vendier as a chief of staff, it's like having a Renault 4 to control the territory of mainland France. That's the analogy. But we do have satellites, not the Navy, but startups, French companies with great technology. I saw that you're working with Unseen Labs, or that they are going to speak. They're a remarkable French company that's doing better than the US competitor, providing very interesting and useful information so that we know when to intervene. Then we have aircraft or vessels that can intervene. But if some of our competitors decide to put higher pressure on our EEZ, then the question will be open. Maybe we'll need partners then to protect our EEZ. There's one area where we're trying to attract our European partners. That's the north of the Indian Ocean. As I was saying, the decontinentalization of energy flows, flows coming from the Gulf. If you go through Hormuz or Bab el-Mandeb, fragile areas that may be even more fragile in the future, we need a strong European presence. You've got Operation Atalanta against piracy that's still in place. That's the only naval operation of the last 20 years that has really succeeded, because Europe put a lot of tools around it. DG ECO provided humanitarian aid. There was political and economic help to the Somalian basin, and that's why it's worked very well. There's a European but not an EU operation protecting the Hormuz Straits. And then there's the coordinated maritime presence. It's a new European initiative to know who's coming to this area and when. So we are working with our European partners so that they have higher numbers to protect this area that's going to be key in the next few years. Pascal Dupoint from Sésame. I have a question regarding French-US cooperation. You were saying that it was fairly close and even closer and closer. When talking about the Ukrainian conflict, we are automatically thinking of potential conflicts in Taiwan. So I'm wondering about this very close cooperation that could drag France into some complicated waters. So I would like to have your opinion on that. Of course. a decision on what could happen in partnership and in support of the Americans in Taiwan. It's not Captain Yann who's going to decide. It's the decisions made at higher levels. It's made by the president. But what we can start thinking on with a chief of naval operations, Admiral Guinée, where are we the most relevant and effective? So that does not preempt any political decision, but Taiwan is very far. It's as far for us as Bab el-Mandeb, Straits of Bab el-Mandeb could be from San Diego. So that's an area where we're involved very often with the Charles de Gaulle, with our carrier group. We have areas for support. We have Djibouti, we have La Réunion, we have a base in the UAE. So if we were to do something in tandem with our European partners, it would probably be there to protect our energy flows to Europe, but also maybe to block any transfer of forces towards the east. That's where we would be the most effective. Will the president want us to be directly involved in Taiwan? It's very political as a choice, but we are present very regularly in this area, but not almost permanently. 2 years ago, we deployed an attack submarine, a nuclear submarine, and it was a great performance, and we learned a lot from that. But once again, the Indian Ocean is an area that we know very well. Maybe one last question. If we project ourselves into the future, 2030 or 2034, to quote the title of the book you were mentioning, what are you worried about? What are you scared about in the longer run? Well, I left home this morning, and I'm worried about my daughter's future because I don't know what world they are going to grow up in. And so what I'm worried about is climate change in 2034. And so there was a meeting a while ago in London between the first Sea Lord and the CNO of France. They were worried about the impacts of climate change. We know that fish resources are going to migrate to colder waters. And if you're talking about climate change, and there's also the protection of biodiversity, that's going to stress a lot of populations, that will strengthen competition. And so the first threat is probably going to be this one. But then I hope that human wisdom will bring us to solve problems with our main competitors of today by 2040, and that will have found a better balance. But that's what I'm worried about when I leave my daughters in Aix-en-Provence in the morning. Any message for our maritime insurers and shipping specialists? By way of conclusion, what would you like to say? Maybe you would have liked to have a longer discussion, but what were you not able to say tonight? What is essential, because there's a big overlap between our concerns, we need to make information flow. The data that flows is massive, and we need to find the right bridges so that the Navy can anticipate on tomorrow's crises, maybe already in your information. If we join the information, you have data that will let us know that the next crisis may not be in Taiwan, but in North Korea or in the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb. And with this information exchange, it's not one way. The Navy can also provide you with information. You'll be more effective in your work. You will be more effective in ours. And that is fundamental in a very complicated world like the one that we're about to live in. Thank you so much, Captain.